Hello, and welcome back to episode 16 of the Emotional Bankroll podcast, a series where I usually interview high-stakes DFS players about the mental health and lifestyle of playing DFS for a living. Today's episode is a little bit different. Welcome, I'm Brian Jester, and today's guest is JJ Zachariason, who you know on Twitter as LateRoundQB and the former editor-in-chief over at NumberFire. Well, JJ recently left that job at NumberFire to start his own site, LateRound.com. So I chatted with JJ about why he made that decision, why he chooses not to play high-stakes DFS or high-stakes season-long fantasy football leagues, his definition of a balanced lifestyle and why that's important, and we had an in-depth talk about fantasy football analysts or fantasy analysts or DFS analysts who either play and win or don't play or don't win, and what that means for everyone involved. So you may have noticed that there haven't been episodes for a couple of weeks, just trying to keep the quality of guest high. So if you or someone you know has an interesting fantasy or DFS or sports betting story, hit me up on Twitter at BrianJesterFF to get them on the show. To make sure you never miss an episode, make sure you're subscribed, whether it's in your favorite podcast app or here on YouTube, to make sure you always get notified. Let's jump into it. All right, let's bring him in. You know him as Late Round QB. I know him as my former editor. JJ, what's up, dude? Welcome to the show.
What's up, man? Yeah, that was a minute ago. You've done quite a bit since the NumberFire days, like winning a lot of money playing DFS. But yeah, man, those were like the glory days of NumberFire back then.
Dude, there was an all-star cast of writers and contributors there. I mean, every time I look back and see, it's like, wow, he wrote there, she wrote there, they wrote there, like everyone wrote there. So, but yeah, you and I worked together, I guess 5, 6, 7 years ago now. And normally this show is reserved for high-level DFS players or sports bettors, but I reached out to you because I believe that what you're doing now, one, not only are you influential in this space, but two, a lot of the topics that we discuss on this show, I imagine you go through as well.
Yeah, I think so too. You know, I'm not, in the same boat and bucket as, the way that you're approaching your career within the fantasy space, but I think that there's a lot of high leverage things that both of us do just in kind of different ways.
For sure. So let's start with the background, because most people know you as Late Round QB. And for those who don't know you or your story, when and how did you get into fantasy football?
Yeah, so like everyone else, I started playing probably in like my early high school years, like maybe like 8th grade, 9th grade. I think I started playing. So this is way back when. I feel like, it's crazy because whenever I started in the fantasy space, I was like the young guy in the space, and now I'm like not the young guy in the space anymore. But yeah, back then, back in the day when like Britney Spears and NSYNC were a thing, that's when I started playing fantasy football a little bit. Started a fantasy league. And that league's still going, actually. I'm still the commish of that league. So it's been like 20 plus years. And so started playing there, and, I just fell in love. I was always the guy that just kind of took it a little bit too seriously compared to my buddies and my league mates. But, it's just one of those things where I think everyone who got into this in some way, especially in fantasy football, but, there was just something that just clicked, that you really saw it as an awesome hobby and a lot of fun to play.
And I think that's a common thread of a lot of people, whether it's on this show or just in this industry, it's that they are obsessive and they take it more seriously than everyone else to start with. So then when and how did you decide to jump into the content side of things?
Yeah, so I graduated from college in 2010, which is crazy to say because now that's over a decade later. I graduated from the University of Pittsburgh, and my wife, who I was dating at the time, she got a job out in Cincinnati, and I got my degree in marketing, but I also have a background in graphic and web design. And so I really wanted to get into like the ad agency world. And Cincinnati is really connected to that world because Procter & Gamble's there. And so I got a job out there at an ad agency. Love the people that I worked with, still have relationships with them today. But I got a job out there in Cincy, and I was a project manager. And I love the people. It was a typical like ad agency vibe, like kegerator in the kitchen and stuff like that. But I just did not get a lot of fulfillment from that job. So one day I remember like sitting there, and I'm like 22, 23 years old. And I'm like, I can't do this for the rest of my life. Like, this is just destroying me mentally. Like I'm thinking like 40 years in advance, and I'm like, how am I going to do something like this forever? And I've always been someone who, like in high school and stuff, I never took like typical jobs. Like everyone's like, yeah, I worked at McDonald's, or I did this, or I did that. Like I self-taught myself how to do graphic and web design. And I used to build websites for people as my like summer job. I just do like 1 or 2 websites for someone, and that would be enough money. You know, you only needed like a couple $1,000s for a summer in high school. And like that would be enough money for me to do my thing, and I'd be good to go. And so, you know, that's sort of like the direction that I always went in, is that, you know, I was trying to not, I didn't really like enjoy getting direction from people that much. I wasn't that great of a worker. I could only work whenever it was something that I was like really passionate about. And so, you know, I didn't love this job, love the people I was working with and all of that. And I still went to my job and did fine. And then one day I remember reading, not one day, but over a course of some days, I read The 4-Hour Workweek from Tim Ferriss. And I started to look at my job a little bit differently. And I started to like find efficiencies or inefficiencies that became efficient within my job. I took an 8-hour day to like a 3-hour day. And so I had all this time throughout the day, which I think a lot of people can probably resonate with at their typical 9 to 5, where like you have a ton of time to do absolutely nothing, right? Like you're just sitting there twiddling your thumbs, you get your work done, and then you're like, what do I do now? Well, instead of wasting that time away, I ended up starting what turned into the Late Round Quarterback ebook. And it was this ebook that I put together because at the time, the fantasy football world, you know, I wanted to find something I was passionate about and all that kind of stuff. In the fantasy football world, all of these touts and analysts out there were saying, draft your quarterbacks early, because it was in a reflection of what happened in 2011, which was that near lockout season where quarterback numbers just went nuts. Like Eli Manning had a career year, like Matthew Stafford threw for over 5,000 yards. Like it was an absolutely insane season. But I knew that strategically it didn't make any sense to like react after one season like that. And there were a lot of reasons, you know, economic reasons and mathematical reasons to not draft quarterbacks early like that. And so I published this ebook, not really having any idea what it was going to do. It was just sort of like this side project that took up some of my time that I just, you know, was passionate about and wanted to do. And so I ended up publishing it, and sort of the rest is history from there.
I mean, that's sick. And your talk about the inefficiencies at work and downtime at work, I think pretty much everyone out there can relate to that. And when we always get questions, I'm sure you get them too, where, hey, I want to do what you do. I want to play DFS more. I want to get into the content creation business more. How can I do that? But I have a full-time job. And I always say that there are definitely ways to turn your 40-hour work week into less hours. And against any former employers listening to this, there's ways to do it, right? And you can make use of your time on someone else's dime. So you make the ebook, right? And you don't know what's going to come of that initially, but what was the initial success of that? And then at what point after that book did you feel confident in thinking that, wow, okay, maybe this could actually be a career, something that I can pursue?
When I published it, I didn't really have like these like crazy aspirations or thoughts that I could like do this for a living. Like, of course I would love to do it for a living, but it was more so like, I think everyone needs some sort of passion project or thing that they love doing. That's not necessarily just their job. Like, it's great if it can be your job, but I do think that people just, if you don't have that fulfillment with something that's outside of like friends and family that you're doing sort of more internally and that you're creating on your own, you're just gonna have a difficult time mentally throughout life, I think. And so, I always like throughout college and into, whenever I started working at that ad agency, I would come up with really dumb and bad like website ideas and stuff that I would publish, and they got zero traction, but it was just something that I could like work on, right? And that's sort of what I saw with this, but this was a little bit, I went a little bit deeper with it. I took a lot of the things that I had learned in the past, like my front-end development skill set. At the time, ebooks weren't very popular. I mean, it wasn't like they are now. Now they're everywhere. But back then in 2012, they were starting to become sort of a thing. Like I did things with that ebook where like I made it responsive on an iPad and stuff. Like whenever you were, if you were to open it on which you can do with like a PDF now. Like it's a totally different world. But back then, you could find ways of differentiating what you were doing. And that was really fun to me. And it was cool to me. And I just loved doing those things. So it was more so a passion project that I was just feeling fulfilled by, more than me thinking that I could do this as a job and that I could do this full time. But I would say that after that 2012 season, so I published it almost 10 years to the day. So I published it in June of 2012. And then throughout that season, things went really, really favorably from a late round quarterback standpoint. That was the year that you had Russ and RG3 and Andrew Luck as rookies. And then a lot of the guys that people were drafting early, just didn't pan out very well. And so after that season sort of like concluded, like maybe into that like November range when people start to see what the trends look like for that particular season, I started to just get noticed more. And I would say that once that started sort of happening, I remember Evan Silva hit me up, and this was before, like at the time, like people weren't as so intertwined within the fantasy space as they are now, where like everyone knows everyone and that kind of thing. It was like, Silva's messaging me, this is a massive, massive deal because he's not like out there just like talking to anyone, right? And it's the same, it's just different now. And now he, has conversations with folks all the time and stuff. And just because it's the way the fantasy industry has shifted and such. But I remember he called me up one day. I was nervous as can be to talk to him. Now I'm good buddies with him, and it's hilarious to look back on it. But and I did a series on Roto World on drafting quarterbacks late and why it's viable and all that kind of stuff. And I would say at that point was the point in time where I'm like, wow, maybe this could be something. Maybe I can turn this into something.
That's super sick. And yeah, everyone remembers that first interaction with who they consider big on Twitter or wherever it is. And so that was the first one for you. And then after the Roto World Series, was that when you went to NumberFire, or was there another stop before that?
Yeah, so I had people don't really know this, but there was like a 3-month period where I wrote for Pro Football Focus. And so I went from, I had my blog, LateRoundQB.com, and I had a blog where I blogged every single day, had a different post every day, and then some writers came on. Some of the writers actually ended up being editors, and they're still editors at NumberFire, which is super sick. And so, like, it's one of those things where, like, we've just been on this journey together throughout this, the last 10 years. But I had some people writing for LateRoundQB.com, and then did the Roto World Series. And then Mike Clay, when Mike Clay was at PFF, before he went to ESPN, he hit me up, and he was like, dude, I love your stuff. Do you want to come over and write some content for PFF? And I was like, sure. So I wrote like 3 pieces of content for PFF. I think one of the articles was like on Roddy White or something like that. Like, that's how long ago this was. And so I did this content for PFF, and then pretty much like 3 months after that started rolling, and I'm still working my full-time job and stuff at an ad agency. I'm actually at a different one now. I got messaged from Nick Bonadillo, who is NumberFire, or was NumberFire's founder, CEO. Like, he's the one who started it. He went on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire back in like 2010 or something like that, when Regis came back, and he won $100,000, and he took that as a seed money for NumberFire. And that's how NumberFire was started. It's all because of Regis Philbin, man. It was all Regis. Yeah. But Nick hit me up, and he was like, hey, the crazy thing with Nick, and the only reason that he probably knew who I was or saw me out on the Twitter streets and stuff, was because he graduated from the same high school as me 7 years prior. So he literally grew up a mile away from me. And so it was just this really weird, like, intersection of this dude who has this insane tech ability, one of the smartest guys I've ever met in my life, who, finds me, who is into this fantasy stuff, and he's started a fantasy company, an analytics company, and he's like, hey, I need someone to do content. And I'm like, hey, I do content. And he hired me on full time in in July of 2013. So it was about a year after I'd published the Late Round Quarterback ebook. I got a full-time job at NumberFire.
I mean, you can't draw up a better story than that. Like, how often does it work out that way? It's about people but you put yourself out there, and people tend to find good content. So obviously you had the web design, and real quick, does your website now, did you design it yourself?
I did everything, yeah. And the crazy thing with that is I hadn't touched any sort of like front-end dev or like graphic design stuff in years. And so like kind of digging back into it and stuff, it was a lot of fun, but it's, I'm not nearly as good as I used to be. Like I mean, the site now is super, super basic, and that's all I need from it. But yeah, it was something that I was able to do myself, which is nice from like an entrepreneur standpoint, that you can cut so many costs by not having to like outsource some of that stuff.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Especially when you're first starting. So that's obviously an area that has helped you get you to where you are today. But are there any other studies or courses or skills or life experiences that you think help you in this line of work? And you can answer that whether it's analyzing fantasy football or starting your own company, starting your own site.
Yeah, man. I think there's probably 2 big buckets. Like, I don't think I'm the best data scientist at all within the space. Like, I am the last person who will tell you that I would be the best. I mean, I think that what I do well and what resonates with people is that I at least understand some of the things that especially other great data scientists are doing and putting together. I can add some flavor to it. I can come up with studies as well. But I think just having that general understanding of statistics is just really important with what we do. It's a numbers driven game at the end of the day. You can say you got to watch film, you got to do. I mean, sure, you should, but this is a game about numbers. Fantasy football is a game about numbers, and if you don't understand the numbers at all, you're gonna have a hard time. It's just gonna be difficult. And so having that general understanding of statistics is important. I was always very good at math. Always ahead in math. That was the only subject I was ahead in, like throughout high school and stuff. Always a couple years ahead. And then in college, took some statistic courses and stuff too. And then, just sort of like a passion. Like I would just keep up with it as I started digging into the fantasy stuff more and more, because you kind of have to, just to kind of keep up with what's going on in the space. But I kind of alluded to it too. I think another really important piece of this is approaching your content creatively. I have a marketing background. I already talked about all that. I graduated with my degree in marketing. Went to that ad agency. I, did a lot of web design and stuff like that. And I was able to get my creative juices flowing that way. It was just always sort of a part of me. But I try to take that with me when I create my content itself. Like there's a lot of people that are starting out who, instead of like thinking of really differentiated and fun ways to present their content, they just do team previews or something. And I've never done team previews. Maybe I did them way back in the day at NumberFire just to get content out the door because we were a startup and we just needed stuff out there. But team previews and stuff like that, like it doesn't do it for me, but I don't think it really does it for an audience either whenever they don't know who you are, if you're not established yet, right? It's the same thing with like rankings. Like the amount of people who would hit me up when I was when I was editor-in-chief at NumberFire to write for the site. And they were just like, hey, check out this writing sample. And it's just like a list of rankings. And I'm like, dude, I don't care. Like it's irrelevant. No one knows who you are, number one. Number two, this is not doing it for me from like a creative standpoint and showing me that, you can think outside the box and you can come up with some really, really unique and cool content. And so I think really approaching everything that I do in more of a creative way. And there's just like small tweaks, man. Like it's not even like you got to go crazy with the creativity. I mean, it's to the point of like the Late Round podcast. I made it 15, 20 minutes instead of an hour, like the hour-long shows that are out there. And so those small tweaks and those small things can make a huge difference as well.
I will say the first article I wrote for you, because you were the editor at NumberFire, your response and your criticism constructive criticism was, no one cares who you are or no one knows who you are. So you have to do it like this. And it wasn't like in like an asshole way, but that made me think about things a lot differently from that point. I guess it's so difficult because there are a lot of people who have the math-based ability and there are the people who have the creative ability. I feel like it's pretty rare to have that crossover just because of the way our brains work. So for you to have both, I think it's probably a big reason why you're so successful today.
I think it's helped for sure. Like I just have a general understanding of, I feel like I have a decent EQ and emotional intelligence, and I can just like hold a conversation and talk to people. Whereas there's a lot of people who are like super data heavy that don't know how to present that information as well. And that's part of the problem. And yeah, like it's something though that I've worked on too. Like being able to present not complex data, but a lot of numbers and such, like in a podcast form or even in an article, and go from point A to point B to point C to point D doesn't just happen overnight. I mean, you can see people, there's been a lot of people who went in and out of NumberFire through the years that I got to see grow and do big things and stuff like that. And I always could pinpoint like, okay, this guy knows what he's doing because he can formulate an argument from point A to point Z in a very cohesive way, whereas some people are like going from A to Z to B to, they're just going all over the place. And so I think that just like general understanding of both sides is important, because it's also sort of like understanding your consumer. It's also understanding that not everyone is going to approach this stuff in a way where they just inherently understand what you're saying. It's like picture like Twitter. If you've curated your feed to be following a bunch of fantasy football analysts, you've seen this before where people just like post charts and they don't explain anything within the charts, right? They're just like posting these things as if you just like understand it automatically. I'm telling you, like, I do this stuff for a living and I don't even understand some of the charts these people post, And I think that there's just like this lack of understanding of like how people think and how people kind of consume this stuff that goes a long way once it sort of starts clicking for you.
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of great points there and a lot of talk about NumberFire. So let's talk about this transition, because you recently made the decision to leave NumberFire where, like I said, you were the editor-in-chief. Now to start your own site, LateRound.com. JJ, what led to that decision?
I always wanted to go out on my own. As I started to like get a little bit more success like in the space and stuff, I think a lot of people that were like close to me, or like, not that they were like super vocal, but they'd be like, oh, his next move's got to be like, he's trying to go to like a big media network or something like that. Like he's trying to like do that sort of thing because he's growing this audience on social media and he's like doing this podcast. He's now in front of a camera more, but that's never been my goal. Like, and I don't really care what, the goals that other people are trying to set for me. I don't care. I know what I want and I know what I enjoy doing. And I've always wanted to just kind of go out on my own and own everything that I'm creating. And honestly, like even like the being in front of a camera stuff, like I don't really like that much. Like it's not, I mean, I fought about that with people at FanDuel for years where, they would want me to do X, Y, or Z, like on a show or in front of a camera and stuff, or like, start to approach like other sports and not just do football. And I'm like, I'm going to do me. Like I got to do me. And because I know where my headspace is at, I know what I do well, and I know what I like to do. And I'm going to just try to do those things as much as possible because who wouldn't, And so I just really wanted to own what I was creating. It's nothing against NumberFire, or FanDuel, because FanDuel bought NumberFire in 2015. Nothing against those two companies. I loved my time with both companies. I met great people. The people there are still great, and they were incredibly supportive of me going out and doing this and leaving. And so I got nothing but good things to say about those places. It's just that I got to a point where the things that I was creating, I wanted to own that and really, if they were successful, I wanted that success. And if they weren't, then I wanted to fail.
And that makes a ton of sense. How long were the pieces being put into place before you sent out that tweet that you're leaving NumberFire?
That's a good question. I would say I knew that I was going to be leaving in August of last year, where, it was always in the back of my head that I was going to, peace out and stuff. But, there were some moving parts. Like I had my podcast, which was started under FanDuel. And so we had to figure out how that transition would work and stuff and how I could, sort of get the rights to that IP. And so I wanted to go to FanDuel as early as possible to let them know that, hey, this is probably my last football season with you guys, because I'm not trying to burn bridges here. Again, they've done a lot for me. I know that I've put in a lot for them. This is a friendship, right? Like this is not a situation where like I'm trying to be like, it's January 1st and the season just ended. I'm like, peace out. All right, I'm going to leave in 2 weeks. I wanted to set it up in a way where not only could everything sort of be closed up in terms of the content I was creating for them, but also, I have really good friends, Jim Sonis, Brandon Gadula, all the editors there over at NumberFire still. And I wanted to make sure they were set up so that when I left, everything was still fine.
Totally. And you couldn't have that podcast sponsored by FanDuel now if you burn bridges. So
that's right. Exactly.
So the other part of this is that you are married, you have a daughter. So obviously providing for your family factors into making this leap as well, because you have this stable job with stable income to moving into the unknown. So what were those conversations like with your wife in making the move?
I had thought about doing this for a pretty long time, and having a steady paycheck is nice. But when I had this opportunity to sort of do this, whenever I approached FanDuel, told them that this could be my last season and all of that, again, I gave them like 4 or 5 months and I knew that it was coming. It was just a matter of like announcing it and getting everything set up. But I really sat down and I crunched the numbers and I just felt really good about everything. I'm really fortunate that, I went out and I did this on my own while having sort of already this established audience. I think that it would be really, really difficult to do what I did, like to sell the things that I'm selling and have a Patreon and like do the things that I'm doing without anything that's already established. Like that would be a very, very difficult thing to do. And I'm both financially, but also just, you're growing an audience from nothing. And it's just a very difficult thing. It's took me 10 years to build up an audience the way that I've built it up and to develop the relationships with that audience too. That to me is more important than just having that like raw number of followers or people who are listening to the podcast and stuff. It's really about, people trusting you and you trusting them. But, I always said this whenever I was working at NumberFire and FanDuel too, that, one of the nice parts about that job is that I was giving a lot to those companies and I was putting a lot in and I was helping those brands grow and the people were great, like I said, but I was also impacting my own audience and the growth of that audience. True. I was killing 2 birds with 1 stone where, I was still sort of like had that idea in my mind that I was going to go out on my own eventually. And so the things that I was doing, it wasn't all lost and just given to those companies. It was also that I was building something on my own, sort of on the side. So having that audience as a baseline, made this not scary. It really has not been a tough transition for me at all. And I say that from the standpoint of privilege in a way, and just being fortunate that I have the audience that I have, and I have such great support. So, when it comes to like my family and such, that steadiness of the paycheck and whatnot is still there. And I didn't have to like worry about, is there going to be food on my daughter's plate tomorrow night or anything like that?
I mean, that definitely helps. And this industry is different. There are other similar industries, obviously, where your persona is public facing. And so that work that you do not only does help the company that you work for, but also helps you as well.
Yeah.
Whereas other industries, people who may want to go out on their own, all the work that they generally put in, their paycheck remains the same while the company grows and makes more profit.
Right.
So that is a big difference there. And so you say you're comfortable with everything, but were you apprehensive at all about doing this, about starting LateRound.com? And I put that in the past tense, but like you literally just started this too. So I guess I could say presently, are you still apprehensive about any aspect of this?
Yeah, man, I think that the one thing that I had in my mind whenever I made the jump was like, okay, I know that I can create content well. I know that I can do that side of things, but my fear is just the standard stuff of being a business owner, like playing customer service person and stuff, like that sort of thing, was just a little bit scary and nerve wracking because I hadn't done that kind of thing in a really long time. And really my job at FanDuel had turned into like, I was like a strategist on the back end in terms of like content direction and stuff, but I really was doing a lot of content creation towards the end of my like tenure there where, stuff like the day-to-day operations were handled by Brandon, a managing editor there. And I didn't really have to like not deal with, but like handle any of the day-to-day stuff that the freelancers were coming to us with and the questions that were being asked or anything like that. It really turned into, I knew that, and FanDuel knew that my time was best served by creating content for the company. And so, that's really what I had been doing for the last couple of years, just basically strictly creating content. So I was like, okay, some of my time now is going to have to go to, being IT guy and being customer service guy, because I'm doing this all on my own. So there definitely was, some hesitation in having to like manage all of that. But what I found is that, I approached this from the perspective of making the business model as basic as possible, where I don't have to spend all that time doing those things. Like I've had so much feedback of people coming to me and being like, yo, you got to just make a subscription website instead of doing Patreon, for instance. And I'm like, well, if I do a subscription website, which is fine, I get it. I understand why people do that. You can make more money doing that. I understand all of that. But a lot of time then is going to be placed on setting that up, IT, dev resources, etc. And I just don't want to deal with that. And I know that I don't necessarily have to deal with that. So I set the business model up in a way where I can still sustain my level of living, but at the same time, I don't necessarily have to put in so much effort into the non-content creation stuff.
Yeah, it's certainly a balance, and those things can be exciting when you first start, right? Like, oh, first day on the Monday, first day being an entrepreneur, I got to handle customer service, I got to talk with IT, I got to do all this stuff. But then a couple weeks roll by, and those start to become the parts of your job that you hate it from your day job, where then it starts to feel like work, right? So that's smart of you to set it up in the most basic way possible for you to balance that. So let's transition a little bit. In one of your recent podcast episodes, one of your mailbag episodes, it's episode 648 for those of you who are listening who want to hear more about this topic. A listener asked you why content creators that also play fantasy or DFS or best ball, why they give away picks if it's just going to erode their edge in their own personal play. And you had a very thoughtful answer. Again, I encourage everyone to go listen to that episode. And I want to dive into a couple of the points that you made. First and foremost, you said that you don't play much high-stakes DFS or season-long fantasy football. So in that sense, you don't really have to worry about giving away an edge because it's not negatively affecting any of your personal profits. But you also said that you don't have the mental state to handle it. What exactly did you mean by that?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So I'll say this, like my wife always jokes with me when I get into something, I go really, really hard into that something. Like I go so hard into like Peloton, for instance, right? Like I tweet about it all the time. I am addicted to this thing because I got into it and now I'm just like really into it. And I got to ride it.
Real quick, can you help their stock prices at all, please?
Oh my God, I know, right? I know, it's been wild. But yeah, like I love it and I go really hard in these things. And it's the same deal with like, if I don't like something, then the opposite happens. Like the stuff that I talked about earlier with my job and like my high school jobs and stuff. When I didn't like those things, I just didn't go very hard into those things and I didn't care enough about those things. And I do think that my content's a pretty good example of that, where I put a ton of effort into like just a single piece of content. Any piece of content that I create I'm putting a lot of effort into that piece. I mean, you find efficiencies through the years of doing things. You can do things a lot quicker now. I can in Excel or a certain coding program. I can do it faster now than I could 10 years ago. But even still, like the things that I create, I care a lot about the things that I create. I'm not trying to like half-ass something that I put out there on the Late Round podcast feed, because it's important that people know that there's a standard to what I'm doing. So with that being said, I think that the comment that I made about having the mental state to handle it is sort of like twofold, where I think I know myself well enough, I'm self-aware enough that I know when I feel overwhelmed or when I would feel overwhelmed. And I don't want to feel overwhelmed. Like I went out on my own because I just wanted to do exactly what I wanted to do and make a decent living, feel cool about it, be super content, build relationships, talk to people about fantasy football all day, wear my gym shorts, ride my Peloton, good to go, right? Like it's an unbelievable like way to live. I don't necessarily need to like make millions and millions of dollars to be satisfied and feel fulfilled. I just don't, and I say that again from the perspective of I'm still making good enough money to be able to sustain a good life. And so I understand that like the stance that I have and the privilege that comes with that. At the same time, I know that if I were to put more effort into DFS, put more effort into season long, I still play. I would say that I'm still putting more money into these things than 99% of the population, right? Like I'm just not a high stakes guy. I'm not doing this full time in terms of playing. I'm not playing DFS full time. I'm just not that. And so I know that I might go crazy from a work standpoint because I know and appreciate the effort that people like you and others, because I know so many full-time players, they're good friends of mine, right? And I know the effort that goes into doing something like that. And I know the time that goes into doing something like that. And I say to myself, okay, well, I only have so much time in a day. Plus I want to be able to hang out with my family. And so if I'm going to be putting so much effort into the content creation side of things, I know I'm not going to be able to put enough effort into that side of things. Or if I start to put in more effort in that side of things, I'm not gonna be able to do as much on the content creation side of things. And I know that that's what really fuels me and what I love to do. And that's where that mental part of the mental state comment comes to mind, or comes in the foresight here, is that I know that I would just go nuts because I really like the content creation side and I really like doing podcasts and I really like talking to an audience about this stuff. That would take a hit if I spend more time being a better DFS player, being a better season-long player. And it's not like the things that I'm saying on my shows don't help with that inherently. They still do, and I still play. That's the thing. It's not like I'm not playing. Right. It's just that I'm not playing to the point of tens and tens of thousands of dollars every year or every week for some people. And then the additive piece to that, the other piece, I said this was twofold. It's honestly that piece. It's the money piece, right? Like I know the swings that occur playing, because that's just what happens. The best players in the world are going to have pretty crazy swings. And it's just the way that it is. You can still be profitable over the long run. I understand that. I'm a numbers-driven person. I understand probability. But I know where my mentality, my mental state can take that. Like I would get way too anxious. It just is not for me. And so the way I sort of see it and the way I sort of wrapped up that question was, people who play high stakes season long for a living, or who play like an absurd amount of money every year and they're making tons of money by doing it, what's on the line for them is very straightforward. It's okay, if you draft Trey Lance this year and he doesn't even start or he busts or whatever, you're not going to make as much money. It's your player evaluation, it's your strategy, all that kind of stuff. Straight up, if it's not good, you're not going to make that much money. But I would also say that from a content creation standpoint or creator standpoint, if you're bad, you're going to lose audience. And if you lose audience, you're not going to make as much money. And I think that's also something that often goes overlooked. And honestly, man, like I have a ton of respect for people who are able to do that and who do that. And I've had many conversations with people who play full time and they've helped me and my outlook on things. I've hopefully helped them and their outlook on things. I don't think it needs to be such a divide that it often is within the space where like there's people who play like high stakes season-long leagues and they hate touts so much because like that. It just doesn't have to be that way, in my opinion. And I think that everyone has something on the line in some way. And to me, I'm not an analyst who like puts stuff out there and just doesn't care if people are successful with that advice or not. Like I need and want them to be successful, not just because I want them to come back, but I care. I care about this stuff deeply. That's my long-winded way of saying that I don't think I can handle the swings, but also I want to focus on the content creation side because I know that I love doing it.
So a lot to unpack there. Real quick, you mentioned the lifestyle that you're living, that you want to live this way, and you get to ride your Peloton and wear gym shorts. So it's always funny to me when I see people in your mentions and they're trying to insult you for being a fantasy football analyst. And myself, I'm like, I don't think that's the insult you think it is, because JJ's living his best life right now and he loves what he does. So that's first and foremost. But two, a couple topics that you just talked about is, so there is that divide that you mentioned, and there is top level DFS players will talk about touts this way. Even people who consume the content will talk about touts this way. Do you think that there is a conflict of interest for analysts who actually play at a high level, particularly DFS and best ball, because everyone's competing for the same prizes? Is there a conflict of interest in selling picks and providing analysis while also competing against the people that are listening or reading their content?
So I'll say a couple of things. Like, the first thing I do want to say too is that I do think that I have a better relationship with people who are playing professionally, because I stay in my lane, like I don't pretend to like be this like DFS pro and dude who can just beat anyone. I don't pretend to necessarily like be able to grind out 150 high stakes season long leagues or anything like that. Like that's not my thing. My thing is that I know that I can help a more advanced season long player who's like in a fairly competitive home league or whatever. I know that I can help them win tremendously well. Like that's my deal. And hopefully people who are playing those high stakes leagues can still take something away from the things that I'm preaching and the things that I study. But the question of like, is there a conflict of interest there? I don't think there is. And the reason I say that is because I don't think, most analysts in general, just, I would say almost all, the only one that probably does have a legit influence is like Matthew Berry, but like that's not even like, I don't think that even he would be able to move markets, right? And I think that's what it comes down to, is that a tout is not going to be moving a market so dramatically that the things that they say are going to have this like very direct and obvious impact on the community as a whole, right? And so, like DFS and best ball, it's just really, really difficult to like dramatically move that market. But then on top of that, I do think there's a lot of groupthink involved, where like one person says one thing, I go out there and I say, I like player X, and there might be, I might have even been influenced by someone to say something like that or think that way subconsciously, and then someone else sees it, and then that sort of latches on, and then people feel more confident in their takes because they see other people, saying something. So there is groupthink involved. But like I said on my show, if I say draft Kadarius Toney, in some hypothetical world, if Kadarius Toney's ADP in a best ball league does shift by like 2 rounds or something, and I'm sitting there and I'm like, man, I've been drafting Kadarius Toney everywhere, and now all of a sudden I can't really draft Kadarius Toney the same way because now he's valued properly. I think that the best players are the ones who are able to react and are the ones who are able to, see what's going on and understand that there's a new sort of expectation involved with this player. I think it's the same deal with DFS. If a player starts the way we see this every freaking week in DFS, where a player starts this week as like a week as like a leverage play, and then as the week goes on, he just becomes straight up chalk, right? And it's because there's a whole bunch of analysts that are touting him as this leverage play. But if that's the case, then like he's no longer that. Like he's not going to be under-owned or anything. So you adjust, right? The best players adjust. The best players understand those adjustments. And I would say that those adjustments are just as, if not more important than player analysis, than just straight up like, you should play this guy or you shouldn't play this guy. And 99% of content out there is player analysis based. Like, it's just, you got to play this guy. This guy's a value. His price is too low. You can get him in the late rounds when he should be a middle round pick, whatever. It's all just based on like drafting or not drafting this player, buying or not buying this player, whatever. But the best players that are playing best ball at a high level, that are playing DFS at a high level, the best players understand the strategic side. They don't just understand the player analysis side, right? And so it's very difficult to teach that side, the strategy side, the side that is more inherently, innately part of you and second nature, as opposed to, hey, Google this and find these players, just throw into your lineup this week. That's a lot easier for the layman to do. And so I don't think that it's that big of a conflict if, these touts who are also playing, a high number of leagues or putting a lot of money in DFS. I don't really think there's a conflict of interest, as long as, of course, they're being relatively truthful, because you don't want them to be lying to their audience. It's just not good business practice.
Right. And I think, like you said, the difference between player analysis and the strategy side, both are very important, and you can still provide both of those types of analysis and not have a conflict of interest because, like you said, you just laid out the player analysis side of things very well. And that's one way that can work. But for the strategy side, and that's what I try to do a lot, is if I can teach you to play the right way, then there's still not really a conflict of interest because you're not going to use that information immediately against me in this very specific contest this Sunday, right? But I'm still doing a service to you of trying to teach you to play DFS the right way, or there are people out there, here's how you can play best ball the right way, whatever that is. And there's also another question that I want to get your take on too, because a lot of people talk about this on Twitter. It's, should the content creator that you're listening to or reading or watching, do they have to be a winning player for them to be a good analyst, right? And this could be betting, DFS, season-long best ball, because there's an entertainment side of things. There's how accurate are they? There's all these different areas, and because this is your line of work, how would you answer that question? Does the analyst you listen to have to be a winning player?
My answer to this is going to make it seem like I'm not a winning player and I'm not good. So
let me preface by saying that.
I can at least preface it, yeah. I see what I do and what others do, what you do in a way, and what others do in the space as their coaches, right? And if you look at coaches across professional sports, the best coaches were terrible players. I don't know if you listened to that Mike Tomlin interview or not, where it was an amazing interview on that podcast, The Pivot. But he mentioned on that show, he was like, what drives me as a coach is that I was such a terrible player. Like that he, and what also drives him is that he knows how bad coaches were and he wants to just make it better, right? And so to me, as long as someone's consuming content and winning off of that content, and doing well with it, and they're coming back, I don't think it really matters. Like if the content's good and they're benefiting from the content, then whatever, it could honestly just be that the content itself, and this happens all the time. And this goes back to the strategy thing that I was just talking about, where, and like roster construction and stuff like that. A lot of times there's analysts that are out there that just don't understand like bankroll management, but they understand how to create decent enough lineups. They just don't understand like which tournaments to enter or how to enter or any of that kind of stuff. Like obviously there's, they're not as winning as they are profitable as they could be because they don't understand sort of those like secondary things that professionals understand better than anyone else. And so I think that there's a lot of instances where, a tout could be giving really good advice and, be resonating with a lot of people and helping a lot of people, and that tout still not being all that good. But I do think at the end of the day, it's obviously for two reasons. It's great to be a winning player while also touting. I think it's just good to be able to say that and to be, to have that sort of as like a backbone, but also it's good from a marketing standpoint. Like if you're able to say, hey, I just did this. I mean, like you won the Millie and it's like, okay, well now look at me. Like I just did this. I know what I'm doing, guys. And people are naturally going to gravitate towards you a little bit more. It's the same deal with like me winning an award or something that's completely worthless, but it's still a way to market yourself. Like it still matters from that perspective. So it's the same way that people handle like the Fantasy Pros rankings contests and stuff, where like I have my issues with that in general, but like, they can still market it and they can still utilize that in some way. And I understand why people enter those contests. So, there's a lot of reasons why it does matter. I just don't think that it's absolutely necessary to have.
Right, and I think it all comes back to the point that you mentioned, is that it's really hard to be really successful playing, whether it's DFS, best ball, betting, season long, to be the top of the game is really hard because there's so many different areas that you have to be good at. So I know if I'm consuming content from you specifically, I'm getting this one piece that you're really good at. It doesn't matter to me if you're not great at maybe one or two other areas, but if you can help me with one specific area, that makes it great. And I would also say, just like from an entertainment standpoint, because we get a lot of content creators who get a lot of hate on TikTok, Twitter, YouTube, whatever it is, and they say, this guy sucks at DFS, this guy sucks at season long, but he has X amount of followers, or said he made this amount of money creating content, when in reality, that's not the game they're playing, right? The game they're playing is to create content and grow followers and have people listen to them.
Yeah, I'm in like this unique spot where I probably care a lot more than like the average analyst does in terms of like being right and like helping people's teams and stuff. Because I know plenty of friends and analysts who just create their content and they want to make their living and They don't necessarily are up in the middle of the night thinking about something they got wrong. I mean, I think about like bad takes from 3 years ago still in the middle of the night, because I ruined, like a couple years ago I faded Derrick Henry and told people to fade Derrick Henry, and it's like those are the things that I hate. I absolutely, I know it's going to happen, but I still despise those things. And I think that I obviously dig a little bit deeper than some of the typical like season long analysts and whatnot. But I do recognize like the game of content creation and the game of trying to grow an audience. And you have to, like, if you don't have that at the front of your mind, then I don't think that you should necessarily be creating that content or have that be like a focal point of what you're doing. Hopefully you are, more of a player as opposed to one of those content creators.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's talk about your lifestyle a little bit, JJ, because you mentioned that earlier that you live pretty free, you're able to do what you want, but I think a lot of people would like to know what it's like just to be in your shoes, a typical work day. So maybe now in the off season, as you gear up for your draft guide and you're gearing up for actual drafts, and then compare that to in season, the grind of the week to week of the NFL season. What's a typical work day look like for you?
Yeah, wake up, drop my kid off at daycare, come home, make a smoothie. No, and then I would say I have learned through the years of like when I'm most productive with certain tasks. Like I know that in the mornings and then at night, I'm most productive at like content creation, at like thinking of different studies and like digging through my spreadsheets and like coming up with different ways to phrase things and writing things and et cetera. So a lot of times my typical day is in the morning. I don't even have my emails open, my inbox opened or anything. And I'm just working strictly on content. Like this morning, all I did was really work on my mailbag episode, right? After my daughter goes to bed, if there's nothing really planned that night, or if like there's nothing on like Netflix that we want to watch, my wife and I want to watch, I'll work and I'll there's different times a year, like this draft guide that I'm creating. I've been working a lot at night after my daughter goes to bed, because she'll get home, around like 5, and then I will have like 5 to 7:30 where we're just hanging out and playing and stuff and watching some Pixar movies and all that good stuff. But, after that, I'm like back in that mode of like, I know that my brain is really working right now because it's nighttime. And so I'll go and I'll start writing content and stuff at night as well. So the reason why, again, I can do more with what I'm creating at LateRound.com. I've gotten so many emails from people that are like, well, why don't you do this? Why aren't you writing content on your site? Why aren't you doing blah, blah, blah? And I'm like, because I don't really need to. Like, I don't want to. And I feel like, isn't the whole point of this to feel really, really content with what you do in life and how you feel and the fulfillment side of things and like the balance of everything? And I just feel like that balance is there for me, right? And I'm like, why would I change that up? It's not like I'm ignorant to how to make more money. It's not that I'm ignorant to how to grow a business. Like I went to business school and I've been around startups, and I was part of a startup that got sold. Like I understand how this game works, but I'm at a point in my life where I have a really, really good balance of everything. And I sort of know where I work well, how I work well, when I work well. And I also know what gets more priority in my life, and that's my family. And so I sort of approach my work and stuff that way. And then once a season hits, things are a little bit different. In season, it is a necessary grind. I mean, I'm doing 4 episodes of my podcast a week. I'm writing a column that gets distributed and read by quite a number of people. And I can't slip. Like I got to be on my game every week. Like I care about this stuff, man. And so I'm not going to just like create stuff that, just to be done with it and move on. I'm creating things that I'm researching heavily that I think people can actually use and that they can win their league with. And so in season, it's definitely a grind. Out of season, it's more of the typical, like what most hours that most people work and stuff. I just have sort of differing hours because I have the flexibility with owning my own thing now.
I mean, that's the best part, right? That's part of the reason why you do this, right? Is because you want that flexibility.
Yeah.
So I don't know your wife's schedule, but how does that work together? Because obviously a lot of people in the DFS space, especially players where they're playing NBA or MLB at nighttime, or they're playing on weekends, they're doing things on weekends. How does that work for your wife, where sometimes you're working at night where she might want to watch a movie, or on the weekend or on Sundays? How does that all work together for you?
Yeah. The other thing too about playing that I didn't even really think about or talk about is that like you have different hours by doing that. Like you got to be ready at lock with all these different sports, and you got to be doing it every night or most nights, and weekends you don't get any rest or anything like that. Like for me, like I get rest on weekends. Like during the season, I'm obviously doing stuff on Sundays and whatnot, but like Saturdays I have a day off like during the season. I'm able to do whatever I want to do. My wife works from home now too. And so, it's nice to have sort of like this just like nice balance of, if I need something or she needs something, like we have the flexibility to go kind of do that thing. But, I think at the end of the day, I've tried to approach this in a way where I have a fairly standardized schedule in a non-standardized sort of job overall. It's a weird job. There's going to be naturally weird hours. I'll do shows with people at 8 p.m. and, have to do stuff at night. And like, obviously during the season, there's weekend work, but at the end of the day, I really still try to approach things and have and I've done this ever since I was at NumberFire because I've been working from home for 10 years. I know it's the cool thing to do now because of the pandemic, but I've been doing it for a while. I've always approached it in a way where my schedule is just like the normal schedule of someone else that's in the workforce. It's just that back in the startup days, I was working a lot. And then in season, I just work a lot too.
Yeah, I mean, having the schedule is so important, right? Like if not, you just get lost in everything that you do. So having a schedule, no matter whether you're out on your own or you're just working from home for somebody else, it's super important. And football is played on Christmas and Thanksgiving. Do you work on holidays too or no?
I really try to avoid it, honestly. Like when it comes to things that I'm passionate about, I'm pretty good at not procrastinating. And so I plan ahead a lot with, when it comes to like Thanksgiving, Christmas, and all that sort of thing. I mean, I was pretty annoyed by the NFL schedule change this past year because I usually would just be done after week 16 because no one plays week 17 for season long. So I was like, all right, sweet. I got this week off now when Christmas is happening and the holidays. Now I don't, but now I have to worry about it and play it because week 17 now is usually going to be around New Year's Eve every year. So that's a little bit annoying, but yeah, I mean, the way I like, if I were to like sum up my, like, I was having this conversation with my wife yesterday. We were on a walk in the middle of the day and I was just like, I was talking to her sort of about like our jobs and stuff. And like, I think that every person, like you wake up in the morning, you have like some amount of energy to give. Right. And you wake up and you might do something that just spends your energy or spends some energy, but you might also do things where you get energy. The reason why I love riding the Peloton so much is because I get so much energy from it. Right. Like I do a midday workout as many days a week as I can, whether it's even just like a 20-minute ride or a 30-minute ride, whatever. I just do it because I get so much energy from that. And when you get that energy, it allows you then later in the day, whenever you do have that downtime, when you are done with work and when you are with your family, to spend that energy with your family. This is why I think that like the idea of a work-life balance is sort of off in a way, because I think people think only in terms of I got to work as little as I possibly can to have this balance. But to me, it's about finding a job that you love doing, because you don't spend that energy hating everything, if any of you listening to this, like have ever had a job or in a job where you don't like it, that spends more energy mentally and physically from your body than if you're really passionate about something, working on something. Like when I find something, when I'm doing a study or something like that for a podcast or for an article, what have you, when I find something and I know that it's going to be something sweet and I can't wait to share it with people, like I'm just like 90 miles an hour going at this thing. Like I love it so much. And then afterwards I'm just so hype. I can't even go to sleep because I have so much energy from it. Right. Because I found that passion point, that thing that I'm passionate about. And that's where I think like that work-life balance thing, like, no, of course there's like a limit. You can't just work 17 hours every single day and expect to have a normal family life. But at the same time, you can have these like random 12-hour days and still be a part of be with your family in some way, because you're doing something that you're deeply passionate about. And if you can find all of those things that you are passionate about throughout life, you're just going to have more of that energy to give and that love to give.
I mean, that's an interesting way to think about it. I agree. I don't think a lot of people do think about it that way. And then if you're like me, and it sounds like you are, because you get obsessed with things, like if there's something that you want to work on, there are days where you'll wake up earlier or you'll go to bed later because you're so pressed about working on this one thing. And you could probably never say that about any other job you've ever had, where you're like, shit, it's 6 a.m. I can't wait to go to work today. Right. It's like, no, that's never going to happen.
Yeah. Like I know how lucky I am that I get to like say this, and that I'm sitting here and I'm like, yeah, I actually like love the kind of stuff that I'm doing. But I think that everyone should at least strive for something like that. And that goes back to what I said at the start. if you can find something that you're passionate about outside of work still, like a hobby or something that you're doing only for yourself, that's not necessarily, yeah, I'm hanging out with my friends, I'm hanging out with my family, I love going to breweries with my buddies or whatever. Like, that's fine, do those things. But if you can do something that's really fulfilling that like goal-oriented mindset and that piece of your brain that is more goal-oriented that you can sort of achieve, if you can find those things, I think it can go a really long way.
Oh, for sure. For sure. Now, another question I want to ask you, because you have been working from home for so long, but it's kind of new now because you transitioned to working for yourself. So many guests on this show have talked about the importance of having a community of like-minded individuals when you do this full time, people that can commiserate with you, that you can talk about the ups and downs with, the day-to-day. People who have a normal schedule can't necessarily relate to what you're going through. And the average person goes into an office and they have coworkers and they can do this. But now, and I guess maybe nothing's changed for you. Maybe you still talk to the same people. I don't know. But socially, how do you handle now being the sole employee owner of your site?
I basically tried to keep, whenever I transitioned to not working at FanDuel anymore, I tried to keep things as consistent as I could from when I was there. So like I had a Slack thread with Jim and Brandon where we would just chat all day and talk about different things. We still do that on Slack. Like, cool. It's, I try to keep things as consistent as possible. Like, one of the things that I care a lot about is just keeping in touch with people and like keeping friendships. And, my wife will poke fun at me and she'll always tell people that whenever you become friends with me, you're friends with me for life, because I truly like try to constantly just be in touch. Like, my best friends are still my high school buddies. And so I think that, that side of me and just like really caring about my relationships a whole lot, just naturally allows me to just constantly be talking to people and being in touch with people. It's more electronic. It's not physical as much. Now my wife works from home. She's been doing that since like October with this new job. It's a full-time like work from home gig. So that's been kind of nice. I mean, I know a lot of people probably are like, oh my gosh, my spouse is at home with me. This is terrible. But like, we know our limits and we know when to like interrupt the other person, all that kind of stuff. And it's nice to at least have another human being to interact with, on a daily basis. So you just kind of learn to like adapt and think of things more from an electronic standpoint as opposed to a face-to-face standpoint. I do miss like the office life a little bit, but it's been so long for me at this point that I don't even really remember any sort of other life.
Right, exactly. And if you're like most couples, you had some practice at the beginning of the COVID pandemic because everyone was working from home. So now that you've had 2 years of experience, right, you know the limits and you know how often you can bug them and walk into their office, right? So
yeah, exactly.
Perception is another interesting question that people who do what we do or this type of industry. So when you meet new people, first, when they say, oh, JJ, what do you do for a living? What do you normally tell them? And then two, what is the general perception or reaction to people when you tell them this is what you do?
Yeah, I'll say like whenever I first started down this like path and I started the late round quarterback ebook and stuff, I can't even tell you how many people were like, what are you doing? But in like a fairly nice way, like just like oh, awesome. But like now I have like a little bit more cred and which is stupid, right? Like it shouldn't matter, right? Like it shouldn't matter that like I can sustain doing this as my, for a living and as a job. That really shouldn't have any like bearing on like whether or not you're going to support me or not.
Right.
But like, obviously I meet people all the time. And like, for instance, my wife and I moved to a new house last year and it's still in the same area and whatnot, but we have new neighbors and stuff and they have no idea who we are, or what we do or anything like that. And I met a couple of them, I remember, and they were like, oh, what do you do? And my answer is basically, I always preface it. I try to get ahead of it before other people can judge me. And so I'm like, yeah, well, I'm a podcaster. And I was like, yeah, I podcast about fantasy football. It's like, it's not like a real job. It doesn't count. Like, and I start to like doubt myself almost in a way.
Right.
Like this is a real thing, almost to just downplay everything and make it seem like, you don't have to, I'll be self-deprecating enough that you don't have to feel the need to feel awkward about this, right?
Right. Real quick, especially when you meet out in the world, you're like, oh, I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer, I'm an actuary. What do you podcast about fantasy football? Oh, okay.
Yeah. Exactly. Like I understand that what I'm doing is not important, like I get it. And I'm not trying, but then there's some people who I talk to about this and I'll like have like a conversation about this, like the conversation that we're having. And they're like, dude, I work at a bank. Like I'm not like, I'm in finance. It's not like I'm doing anything important either. And so,
Sure.
you at least like, I will say though too, is that like with this job, I'm sure you've dealt with this a ton too. The conversations then when you meet people, it then just transforms to you just talking about your job constantly.
Pretty much. Yeah.
Because they're interested, right? And I'm not the kind of person that necessarily like wants to just talk about that, because I don't want to just take over the conversation and make it just about like me and my life. But then I also recognize that like, you know, like I was at a birthday party this past Sunday for my daughter and for one of her classmates, and they're turning 4 years old, and there's just a bunch of dads hanging out on the side while all these kids are playing and stuff. And it's like, what do you talk about with a bunch of dudes? You're talking about sports and stuff. And then like, that's your job. So naturally, like they're going to want to poke and ask questions about like what you do and like what your podcast is like and like how awesome it is and like how you got that job and all that kind of stuff. And I've sort of like accepted that fact that this is just how it's going to be, because it's more interesting than someone who works in supply chain or something like that.
Right.
But it's still awkward for me. Like it's never going to not be awkward. And I've gotten to the point though where my go-to like phrase of what I do is I'm a fantasy football podcaster, because it's the easiest thing that people can like I know that you know, seeing what I do for a living is not just I'm just a podcaster, but to
Right.
a random person who doesn't even understand that there's a fantasy football market and economy, like they're not going to understand that. Oh yeah, I sell draft guides and I have a prospect model where I talk, like they're not going to understand this stuff. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but it's an interesting question, right? And I have some guests on the show that love to tell people what they do, and there are others that just get super pissed about it and they just don't want to deal with it. I personally, we have a passion for it, right? I enjoy talking about what I do. Like maybe some of the financial specifics they can get kind of gross, right? If people start asking about that, and right, because then it feels like bragging to us, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Right. But then like the alternative is, because I was at a birthday party this past weekend too, and there are other boyfriends and husbands there, and yeah, sick brag, I was at a birthday party, right? And so normally, right, you're talking with these guys, it's like, oh, what do you do? I do this. Okay. And then it's a one-word answer. Oh, this weather's great. Oh, what kind of beer are you drinking, right? And then that's just the conversation, right? But if you talk to people, now you start to have new types of conversations about these types of things. Yeah. So the scenario I was at, it was three of us, and we were watching the TV, and some guy was like, man, I wish I could gamble professionally or like play poker for a living. And the other guy who knows me was like, do you know what this guy does? Like, do you know what he does? You can talk to him about it, right? And it's like, okay, for the people who like don't know about it, it gets kind of exhausting. But for the people who are truly interested in what you're doing, then it becomes an exciting conversation.
Look, I want people to know that this is what I do. Like I want my neighbors that are around me who we roughly, don't know super well because we just moved here into this neighborhood, but like I want them to know that like this is what my job is, because it's interesting and different and I'm proud of it, right? Like I've built an audience and I'm now sustaining my life and making a living and making money and doing all of that on my own through something that I built myself. And like that's something that I should feel proud of, right? My thing is more so just like the initial piece of that conversation, right? And there's always like I swear in like a normal, like, and I understand that Twitter is again curated a certain way and people are going to be searching out for certain people and stuff like that. But I swear like 99% of people that I talk to, none of them play fantasy football. Like somehow, like we know that like 60% of the freaking United States plays fantasy football, but everyone that I meet does not play fantasy football. So they like don't understand this whatsoever whenever I start talking about it. But then every once in a while you get the guy, like I've met people who actually like didn't realize it, but they were following me on Twitter.
Oh, no shit.
Yeah. And so like, it's cool when like that kind of stuff happens because they know the space. I love meeting people that are like really, really into this stuff and like really into this, like they know different touts and stuff like that. And like, I can have conversations with them about like, because I know so many people in the space and different analysts and stuff. And I can be like, yeah, like he's a great guy. And like, just having conversations about like their perception about these analysts and their perception about their work and all that kind of stuff, just so that I can sort of just see what the perception is out there, because I have no idea otherwise.
Right, exactly. And if you're like me, then there's the initial part is judging who you're talking to, or at least trying to get a gauge of where they are, and starting with the highest, most generic level explanation. So for me, it's like, I do sports analytics, right? And then if they have a follow-up question, then you can get a little more in depth if they want to, right? Or if they're like, oh, okay, that's cool, then it's like, good, I don't have to go any detail because you don't care about it. But the people who care about it, then they can start asking questions, and then it becomes a more natural conversation.
Yeah, I used to, my go-to used to be, oh, I'm the editor-in-chief of a sports analytics company.
Oh, there you
go. That's what it, and then if they were like, oh, and then I would dig deeper and be like, yeah, I do content myself, and I have this audience that listens to my stuff and all that. But if they're just like, oh, that's cool, then I know that they don't really care.
Right. And that's good for everybody involved, right? So,
yeah.
All right, JJ, I'll let you get out of here. Just a couple more questions for you. And this one's about the future, because it is important, because you just jumped into your own, started your own site, and it's always the unknown of what the future holds because at least on the DFS side, the future is a question mark. Sports betting is exploding in all these legal markets. But I think season long will always have its home, at least in the United States. So, but where do you see the future of fantasy football with all these areas intertwined?
Yeah, I think for like if you take like the season long market, I think that you're gonna just see more and more people get more and more involved with it because it's maturing, and you're gonna just see more like dynasty stuff becoming bigger and all that kind of deal. But from like a bigger market standpoint, which is sports betting, I think you're just gonna naturally see more of a gamification within sports betting, more player prop related stuff that gets mixed in there. But I'm not just thinking like straight up player prop stuff. I'm just thinking about all the startups that have already popped up that are based on player prop related things, but are in that sports betting bucket as opposed to the DFS bucket, as opposed to the season long bucket. Because that's the way that you're going to attract an audience that's already looking at the player level stuff naturally. So, right. And we have to be realistic too, that the majority of people that are sports betting are still people that are not doing it at like insane stakes, right? And the way that you can really get them is by looking at the things that they're already looking at and that they love, which is the player analysis stuff with season long and with fantasy football. And if you can leverage that in a sports betting market, I think that's the way to sort of grab hold of them and bring them in. And then obviously from there, they can start betting lines and doing over-unders and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think there's going to be a lot of mixing and gray area as the industry continues to grow.
There already is, honestly.
That's true. That is true. I mean, what's the difference between any of these player prop sites and DFS? And you're all doing the same type of analysis anyway. So, all right, let's leave here with some final advice, JJ. I asked these two questions to every single guest. It's a little bit modified for your place in the industry, but what do you think is the most important skill to have in being, and you can answer this however you want, whether it's a content creator, a fantasy football analyst, wherever you think, but what is the most important skill to have?
As an analyst is humility. And I think that because humility allows for more realistic self-reflection. If you think that your what don't stink, then anything that you put out there, you're not going to really be able to take a step back and be like, why did I get this wrong? How did I get this wrong? Because you just think that, I just got unlucky or something like that. If you're not, this is a very humbling game that we play, whether you're playing DFS, whether you're playing season long, what have you, very humbling game. So I think being able to be self-aware and having that self-reflection is going to really allow you to hone in on your process a little bit better and then just be better next time. I mentioned that Derrick Henry example before. Like if I can walk away from a season and, like last season, this is a better example. Last season, I'm like, don't draft Damian Harris. Damian Harris is not a great season-long pick, whatever. And then obviously, the logic behind that was, look at the history of the New England Patriots, and they don't use bell cows. When there's been a running back that's seen a 45% running back rush share, they never see a 5% target share, all that kind of stuff. Because we know they use different running backs. And then Damian Harris goes out and he has a decent season, right? And so, I look at that and I say, okay, well, was my process really that wrong? And I look and I'm, Damian Harris probably had like a 98th percentile outcome for Damian Harris last year. And I can't be that upset about it, right? Like I can't be that mad when those crazy things happen. So I can at least move on from that, say the process was fine, whatever. But there are some times where I just straight up miss. Like when Stephon Diggs got traded to the Bills, I was not that into him at his ADP and I just straight up missed it. I had really, really flawed logic. And if you don't have that self-reflection, I do an episode of my podcast every year on the things that I missed because I want to go through that process and talk through it and look at the things that didn't go my way because it's important to grow from that. So I'd say humility is probably the number one thing to have as an analyst.
That is huge, and it does take a lot to be able to admit to your mistakes. And you say you can't get mad at those things, but JJ, you can certainly get mad when things happen when they're not supposed to. But you just understand that it's gonna happen, right?
Yeah, right. Like there's I'm not mad when process is fine. I'm mad, but I'm not like overly mad. When I'm overly mad, like when I'm like super upset about something, is like when the Stephon Diggs thing, where like the logic that I use just like wasn't that strong. And I knew, you sort of have that inclination whenever you're even saying those things and putting those things together, but it's still just not, it's the same thing with DFS where like, you have a guy that you're really into one week, you just don't play him nearly as much as you would want to or should have. And then he blows up and you're like, why didn't I, like, you just don't know why you didn't do that thing. And you're just upset about it overall.
Totally. All right. And it's the final question. What would you tell someone who's listening to this podcast that either wants to play fantasy full-time or analyze it full-time? What would be your advice to them?
I'd say differentiate. do things that others are not doing right now and do it with purpose. Like find an actual reason why that thing that you're differentiating is worthwhile, and then just run with it. Like focus on that one thing. Don't be the team preview guy. Don't be the rankings guy. Be the guy like Matt Harmon who created reception perception, right? Do the thing that's different that really allows you to stand out. I know it's obvious. It's just something that people lose sight of very, very often.
And that's enlightening because I know you were talking about that from an analysis perspective, a fantasy football analysis creator perspective, but that applies to DFS as well.
Yeah.
Because if you find something different and you go all in on it that the field is not doing, that other analysts aren't talking about, that's how you can make a ton of money and be successful. So I think that works both ways. So JJ, I appreciate your time, man. This was an excellent conversation. It was great to catch up with you. And I'll give you the floor now. If there's anything you want to promote, anything you want to talk about we haven't talked about, now's the time.
Yeah, so all my stuff is over on LateRound.com. You can check that out. I have a Patreon where I have like rankings and stuff like that. There's a little community there. We have a Discord for one of the tiers, and there's really good conversation in there. But I also have a draft guide that I'm publishing on July 1st. And I sort of approached it in a way where instead of doing like the typical player analysis stuff and, the breakdown of your top 200 and all that kind of thing, I went up and I approached it from more of a strategy level. And so I did a lot of studies in there to find how to find breakout players, why regression matters so much. I looked at positional value, overall positional value for every position in fantasy football. So I looked at it, and I still throw in like players to target, avoid, all that kind of stuff. But it's much more the meat and bones of this thing is much more focused on the strategy aspect of fantasy football as opposed to just pick this guy.
I can't wait to grab my copy of the guide. I'm going to do so as soon as we finish recording here. So go check that out, LateRound.com. JJ, appreciate you jumping on as always, and everyone out there, appreciate you listening and tuning in.